Okay, perfect. So you guys can hear me all right? Awesome. Yep, you can definitely use the Q&A feature. We just went live on Facebook as well. So if you guys are just now joining us, um, we're excited to have you. We officially start our program in 7 minutes. It'll be 2 members of our education department staff here at the National D-Day Memorial. We are so excited to share with you guys a little bit about what we do when we have students here on site. We're actually pulling out artifacts, some that were from the D-Day invasion, and talking about what it was like to land that day. So we'll be getting started shortly. In the meantime, if you're watching on Facebook Live, feel free to comment anything that you may be wondering about D-Day. We may be able to answer those towards the end. We do plan on having a Q&A time towards the end of the Facebook Live and also your field trip Zoom session. So perfect. So it looks right now like we have folks from California. So and it looks, yeah, from, I'm probably going to mispronounce this, but Natamas Charter School in Sacramento. That's awesome. So West Coast, East Coast right now. Very exciting stuff going on. So we're going to get started in just about 5 minutes now. So you guys know the drill. We're going to wait for everyone to be able to join. Because with Field Trip Zoom, we did promote this as a 1:10 p.m. Eastern time start time. So perfect. It does look like having a space shuttle, doesn't it? This actually is a building called a Quonset hut that would have been used during World War II, and it was actually used after the war for even things like college dormitories. So we have a very unique space to do a lot of our educational programming in. So it looks like a space shuttle. It's a little bit better than what they would have had in World War II because I have very great lighting. You can see the insulation above me, those little, I don't know, it kind of looks like clouds or pillows almost. So it helps to insulate this building because it would get very cold in the winter and very hot in the summer. So great comment there, Miranda. I really appreciate that. So perfect. So again, we'll be getting started shortly. I appreciate you guys' patience right now as we get everything up and running. I'll turn it over in just a few minutes to our Director of Education, John Long, who's going to get this started. I'll jump in for a little bit and he'll wrap it up. Absolutely, Becky, we're glad to do this for you guys. It's a really unique way to be able to still connect with each other during these challenging times, these very uncertain times. So we enjoy this just as much as you guys do. So it looks like we also have a homeschool family from British Columbia watching right now. So excited to have everyone. It looks like we're all from different places. That's the beauty of live streaming, is that we can connect no matter where we are and learn a little bit more together. So, hey, Daryl. Perfect. Let's see. So again, if you're watching through Field Trip Zoom, you can comment within the Q&A about where you guys are watching from. If you're watching through Facebook Live, comment on the post and let us know where you guys are watching from or any questions you may have. So it looks like we have Quebec, someone from Quebec, Sophie from Quebec, Colorado, 9th, 7th, 4th, and 3rd grade. Wow. We have lots of folks. Texas even. Shout out Julie for that. So we have about 2 more minutes. So we'll be holding tight just for a little bit longer. And I promise you guys will see me again. We'll switch to our Director of Education, John Long, shortly. So we have quite a bit from Southern California. We have Virginia watching. Wow, this is awesome, guys. New York. Hey, Julia. It's great to see you. Looks like we have Michael from Kentucky too. So lots of different places. Perfect. So we're here in Bedford, Virginia. You guys have probably never heard of Bedford, Virginia, unless you're watching maybe one of our volunteers, or maybe you visited on a field trip before. So we're glad to have you guys along. We're going to get started in just 1 minute. So if you are watching on Field Trip Zoom, again, a reminder, if you have any questions, put them in the question and answer feature. If you're watching on Facebook Live, put them within the comments. We're going to be monitoring both of those throughout the program. So excited to have you guys along. And without further ado, I am going to turn it over to John Long, our Director of Education, in just 1 second.
Welcome to the National D-Day Memorial, at least virtually. My name is John. I'm one of the education staff here at the memorial. We're located in Bedford, Virginia, which had the highest known per capita losses of any community in the United States on D-Day itself. But we pay tribute to the valor, fidelity, and sacrifice of all of the Allied soldiers who landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944. And it's our honor to be able to pay tribute to not only ones who gave their lives for our freedom, but also those who served and came home to tell the story. Here at the D-Day Memorial, this time of year, beautiful spring day, normally we'd have school groups. But as you know, most schools across the country are currently closed. Our field trips have been postponed and canceled. And this is an opportunity for us to reach out to a different audience and continue our educational mission, telling people about D-Day, paying tribute to the soldiers, raising awareness of what happened and why it was important. And again, it's a great privilege to be able to do that and to welcome you here with us. The program we're going to do is largely based on what we would do for a school group if you were here as part of a 5th grade tour or a 7th grade tour or whatever. Experience some of the artifacts, talking about the average experience of the soldiers on D-Day, and especially American soldiers, obviously, because most of the equipment we're going to show you is going to be American. But this is, say, a way that we help to raise awareness of some very important history. Before we talk about that equipment, though, it's worth asking, what in the world was D-Day? Why was it important? What happened? And to do that, I'm going to turn it back over to Maggie, my co-worker, who is going to tell you a little bit of the background about the Normandy invasion. So Maggie, come on up.
Perfect. Thank you, John. I am so excited to be with you guys today. And we're going to get started just by looking at the invasion from a large scope. So D-Day was on June 6, 1944. It occurred in Normandy, France. Now, to be honest, there were dozens of D-Days throughout World War II, but what makes the invasion of Normandy, France so special? And that's because it's the largest amphibious invasion in military history. And to show you guys that, I have this infographic here that kind of highlights a few of the different things that make it so significant. So we have over 10,000 aircraft that are going to be in the air on June 6, 1944. And we're going to have thousands of ships in the English Channel doing different things like transporting men, transporting supplies. Some of your battleships are going to be bombarding the coast to try to get rid of obstacles, to make it an easier landing for our soldiers. And the most important thing, and as I tell our field trips regularly, in order to have a successful invasion, you're going to need men. There are going to be over 150,000 men who land on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. And so this is what makes this the largest invasion in military history. Now, this map here, I know there's a lot going on, so I'm going to try to explain it just briefly so you guys get a better picture of what is happening. So down here in yellow, this is France. So we're coming across the English Channel from England with our ships, with our planes, with our equipment and our men. We are going to be landing on certain key spots along the coast of Normandy to start making our way in to go towards Paris and eventually make our way to Germany. So it starts with an airborne drop starting at midnight on June 6, 1944. Then we have some deceit that's going on, trying to fake out the Germans. And then really what is most of us consider to be the invasion itself begins at 6:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944. And that's the invasion where the men are hitting the beaches. Now the Americans are going to be landing on Utah Beach and Omaha Beach here. We have the Canadians here on Juno, and then we have the British here on Gold and Sword. So we have a lot going on. If you see here in the purple, maybe a little bit more difficult to see, there's lots of little German batteries. So this isn't going to be an easy, just land on the beach, make your way quickly into France. The Germans have been waiting for us for a while. They've been training, preparing for this moment. They knew it was going to happen. So what they did was they created something called the Atlantic Wall, where you have all of these different obstacles in your way as you're heading up towards the beach. Now, this line right here, the dotted line, that's high tide. And if you notice, the hedgehogs that look like jacks, the ramps, the mines, and the Belgian gates are all below that high tide line. So that's why it's so important that we land at low tide so that we can see as many of these obstacles and navigate around them as possible. So there's different things once you would get onto the beach. A little bit further in, you're going to have barbed wire minefields. And then up on the cliffs, you have these German batteries and pillboxes. So they're waiting there, anti-tank, anti-aircraft, waiting for an invasion to happen. This is not going to be an easy task whatsoever. So one of the things we focused on during this program is what was it like for one of those guys? It's so easy for us to think about it in large numbers and large terms, but the fact of the matter is that these men who storm the beaches are just like you and I. They're people with families, friends, dreams, and hopes, and they're going to be landing on these beaches, and they're going to be the key to the success. So I'm going to turn it over to John again, and we're going to talk about the specific pieces of equipment that these soldiers would have carried.
Okay, great. Thanks, Maggie. On D-Day, remember we're starting the invasion in England and crossing the English Channel into France. How are we going to get there? Well, there's really three ways. Some of the men are going to come in by air. We can't land our planes in France because we don't control the airfields, but we can drop men in by parachute. And so 3 divisions of paratroopers are going to land behind the beaches on D-Day. Second way, some of the men are coming by glider. Some of the paratroopers don't jump with parachutes. They ride gliders, unpowered aircraft, in to land and seize key crossroads or bridges. The third way and most common way that men are coming to France on D-Day is by landing craft. In other words, by sea, by boat. They are coming and crossing the beaches. Most of the equipment we're going to show you today deals with those men crossing the beaches and especially the American beaches of Utah and Omaha Beach. And I'll also say that I'm going to show you some typical equipment. Probably no 2 men on D-Day had exactly the same things. What you're carrying is going to depend on what your job is, somewhat by personal preference. You might be carrying a piece of equipment and you have to find the guy with the other piece of equipment to put it together. You might be carrying an 80-pound radio on your back instead of some of these other things. If you're a medic, you're going to have different medical equipment. It's all going to vary. So I'm going to show you again, it's typical, but certainly not universal. But one thing that is universal, every man on D-Day that's landing, coming across the beaches, out of their landing craft, they're going to be in uniform. And so let's talk a little bit about the uniforms that would be worn by the men. But first, I have a question for you that maybe you can answer in the Q&A. Notice all this is a little bit green, different shades of green. why green? Why are these men wearing green on D-Day? So answer the question there in the Q&A feature, and we'll get back to that in just a second. But you notice this mannequin here, he's got his uniform on. One thing you probably can't tell from where you are is that this is fairly stiff material. It's actually wool. Now remember the date, it's June 6, 1944. Depending on where you live in the country, you probably weren't wearing wool last June 6th. It's a pretty hot material. It's usually what you wear in the winter. So why are they wearing this in the dead of summer? A couple of reasons. One is because northern France in early June is not nearly as hot as a lot of the United States in early June. It was actually kind of a chilly day. It wasn't really cold, but it was kind of chilly. Storm had come through the day before and actually delayed the invasion 24 hours, incidentally. But wool is a warm material, and this is important. It also is a material that insulates even when it's wet. And so these men are coming into France typically soaking wet from their waist down, often from their neck down. They are wet, and we can't have them suffering from hypothermia. They won't be a very effective fighting force. That's why our soldier here has also got a jacket on. Not every man would be wearing that jacket, but it certainly was an option. And important that he stay warm. Notice he also has, of course, his dog tag for identification purposes. He, in case he is wounded or killed, that will help to identify him. And it's absolutely essential that he keeps that. Typically, he has two dog tags, one on a chain around his neck, the other one somewhere else in his boot, in his helmet, in a pocket, so that if he loses the one around his neck, it can be he can still be identified. And then let's see if we got an answer before the.
We do. Everyone has been unanimous with the answer of camouflage or blending into their surroundings.
Absolutely right. This shade of green, olive drab, it's often called, was designed as camouflage. It's not the camouflage material you might see a hunter wear today or modern soldiers wear, but it does help to blend in, because Normandy is a very agricultural region. A lot of farms, a lot of fields, a lot of hedgerows, and this will help for the man to blend in. So very good answer. I can tell you're thinking. Other thing you might notice on our mannequin here is, of course, he has got his helmet on. Helmet is absolutely essential. He's required to have it. In fact, this one has broken straps. He'd be required, if the strap weren't broken, to have it strapped under his chin as well so he can hang on to it. The helmet is absolutely essential to protect his head, not so much from bullets, because they're not really bulletproof the way that modern military helmets are, but to protect him from shrapnel. Shrapnel is the debris from any kind of explosion. So the Germans are firing big artillery pieces at the beach, and they are going off near him. And when the shell explodes, pieces of that shell become shrapnel. If it hits something on the beach, say a Jeep that is there, pieces of that Jeep might become the shrapnel. And shrapnel causes a lot of injuries. We can't have this man as a fighting force if he is injured. And so his helmet is absolutely essential. He's going to wear that as much as possible. And in fact, talked to a lot of D-Day veterans who told me if they lost their helmet on D-Day, one of their first jobs was to find another one. They would scramble around until they found another replacement helmet, because it's absolutely life-saving whether he has his helmet on or not. Another piece of life-saving equipment that's very important on D-Day is this. Looks like maybe a piece of hose. It's made out of rubber. It's got these valves on the front. This is actually his life belt. Remember, they're coming across the English Channel. They're coming on landing craft that could be hit by an artillery piece, could hit one of those obstacles Maggie showed you, could hit a mine. And this man might end up in the water. Or he steps off the ramp of his landing craft into water that's over his head unexpectedly. The average man on D-Day is carrying 80 to 100 pounds of equipment. And you can imagine if I put an 80-pound pack on you and drop you in water over your head, what's going to happen? You're either going to drown or you're going to lose that pack to get back up and get some air. The life belts were designed to give you some buoyancy. These would inflate. You would turn the valves on the front. If you found yourself in water, these would inflate to 3-4 times its size and give you some buoyancy. There was a problem with the life belts, though, on D-Day. Not everyone got really good training with these. And because it's a life belt, where are you going to put it? A lot of the guys put it around their waist because it's a belt. Problem is, as we'll see in a minute, he's also got a very heavy pack on his back that weighs maybe 80 pounds. And if he has this around his waist and a heavy pack on his back, how's he going to float? Upside down. It's not a good way to float for very long. What needed to happen actually is they need to wear this up or under their arms to give them the buoyancy they needed. And unfortunately, not many of the men received very good training on that. And a lot of men actually drowned on D-Day. They weren't hit by enemy fire. They were drowned in some cases by their actual life belt that was supposed to save their life. Did work in many cases, of course, but for some it didn't. Another piece of life-saving equipment that was anticipated would be needed, but actually wasn't, was this rubberized bag, which was worn right here under my chin. I have it on, and if you want to guess what's in it, not some piece of, well, not ammunition or anything, it's actually a gas mask. Back in the First World War, the Germans had used poison gas on the battlefield, and up to this point in World War II, it hasn't been used on the battlefield. However, we don't know if it's going to be used on D-Day or not. We are prepared for it just in case. For all we know, the German plan to stop the invasion, and they know the invasion's coming. They just don't know when and they don't know where. They know it's eventually going to happen. What if their plan is to use poison gas against the invading forces? We've got to be ready for that. And so every man is issued this gas mask that he wears right up front under his chin where he can get to it quickly. Many of the men also have around their arm this paper sleeve called a brassard sleeve. It sounds like paper. On D-Day, it would have been chemically treated so that it would turn color if there were poison gas in the air. If you look over at your buddy, he's got one of these on and it starts to turn sort of a pinkish color, you know you're in trouble. You're going to get your gas mask out very quickly and put it on. Another thing that was done, this uniform that I showed you earlier for the men of D-Day, it was actually soaked in this kind of chemical, almost like a shellac thing that make it very stiff and uncomfortable. That was used to, in case there were a gas attack, the gas couldn't get through to your skin. But it also made your uniform hotter, didn't breathe very well, and it smelled terrible. It smelled like sour milk. In fact, the men called them skunk suits on D-Day, and they didn't like these at all. But it was considered necessary because there could be a gas attack against the forces. Turns out that did not happen. We were prepared for it, but there was no gas attack. The Germans did not use poison gas on D-Day, and the gas masks typically were discarded soon after the invasion. The men weren't going to carry it around when there didn't seem to be any great risk. However, we were prepared for the eventuality if they had used the gas. So what about your other equipment? You can imagine some of the equipment you're going to want with you on D-Day in order to invade, because you're going over there not just for the invasion of one day, you may be there for weeks and weeks. And what you have with you on your back, that 80 to 100 pounds of equipment, that's pretty much everything you're going to get until they set up some supply depots and you're able to get some further equipment down the road. And so you're going to carry on D-Day a pack of some sort, maybe a couple of packs. This is where you're going to have your blanket, where you're going to sleep that night. Not a sleeping bag. Sleeping bags do exist, but you're not issued that on D-Day. You got a wool blanket you're going to wrap up in at night down in a foxhole that you're going to dig for yourself. Got your mess kit so that you can eat later on, but you're probably not going to get much to eat on D-Day. You're too much of a stressful situation. And if you get a chance to eat anything, it's going to be something very quickly gobbled down cold. But you do have your rations with you. And the rations typically look like this. The American rations anyway. This is called a K ration. This is particularly the supper unit. So it would have more dinner type meals. And what's in here is some type of canned meat. The actual menu varied a little bit, but some sort of canned meat or a stew that you could eat cold, but you could also heat up if you had the opportunity. You won't on D-Day, but maybe a day or two later. It had some crackers. It had some instant coffee. And one thing that was always in the K rations in World War II was a small pack of 4 cigarettes. Sounds terrible now, but back in World War II, most men smoked, and they were issued a small pack of cigarettes with every one of their meal kits. They didn't know at that time how unhealthy smoking was, and so it was issued to the men nonetheless. You typically carried about 3 days worth on D-Day. Now, I mentioned earlier that the invasion was delayed 24 hours because of a storm on June 5th. So some of the men ate 1 day of their rations earlier. So when they actually land in France, they're going to ration for a while. What are you drinking? Well, we've also got on a belt, usually about right here, you've got your canteen with about a quart of water. Doesn't sound like much water, does it? It's not. However, this was important because you got to stay hydrated. Not worried about water supply too much. France is a pretty well-watered area, but even so, you're going to ration it. You don't know when you're going to come to a spring or a pump at a farm or some way to be able to resupply this. So you're going to hang on to your canteen as well. Before I go on with some of the other supplies, let me ask you a question. I got this little thing. I'll talk about it in a minute. But for the moment, this was also worn on your belt with your canteen. Some of the paratroopers may have had it up on their helmet. But I want you to guess what is in here. What could this be? Put your guess in the Q&A feature, and Maggie will give us some sense in just a minute. Another piece of equipment you can have that's very important. This looks like a knife, and it is, but it's a very specific type of knife called a bayonet. The bayonet was useful not only as a knife, but also as a weapon. This could be mounted on the front of your rifle to use it as a sort of stabbing weapon. Typically on D-Day, you're not close enough to the enemy to be able to use it for that purpose. And so your bayonet really became more of a tool than a weapon. This is the knife you're going to carry around to cut a piece of rope, cut down some branches to make a shelter, or cut up an apple you happen to find in an orchard or whatever. Bayonet was a very important piece of equipment, as was this little shovel called an E-tool or an entrenching tool. I mentioned earlier, you don't get to stay in a nice fancy French hotel on the night of D-Day. You've got to find your own shelter, and that involves digging a hole. And so strapped on the back of your pack is this, this E-tool that you would use for digging your foxhole that night. Also, I should mention a minute ago, I mentioned the pack. Not everyone had a pack. If you notice this vest that this mannequin has on, has these pockets, and on the back is sort of a pack here. This invasion vest was issued to some of the soldiers, not all of them, to carry their equipment, and was not very popular with a lot of the men. They tended to be heavy and bulky, and they got in the way of everything else. And so these vests, typically, they were thrown away a few days later as well, and traded in for a better pack that they were used to carrying. The invasion vests, not many of them survived because the men hated them so much they threw these things away. All right, Maggie, did we get any answers on the guess of what this item is?
Absolutely. So right now I have a few different answers from you guys. I have mail, I have medical supplies, matches, a filter to clean the water. Someone jokingly said an iPhone. Those weren't invented until I was in high school. Letters to family, a medical emergency supply, a poncho maybe, ammunition. So John, I'm going to turn it back over to you. What is in that pouch?
Well, those of you who said medical supplies, you were right. This is your first aid kit that you are issued as a soldier on D-Day. And if you look at this, going into the dangers of war, and you look at this first aid kit and say, there's not much there, you're absolutely right. This first aid kit really only contained a couple of things. There is a dressing in there, a big gauze pad that would be used for a wound, and it's compressed inside this metal box so that if I open it up, it kind of poofs out to be much bigger. The only other thing in these is a little envelope of disinfectant powder called sulfa powder that was used to treat wounds. Prior to World War II, what killed more men on the battlefield was not so much the bullets, it was the infection that came after the wound. And so the invention of disinfectants like sulfa powder or medicine like penicillin help to really cut that rate of infection afterwards. So let's say you were wounded or your buddy next to you is wounded on D-Day. You are going to, first of all, open up your pouch, which is on your belt or on your helmet, open up the can and take out the sulfa powder, sprinkle it on the wound, and then put the bandage on there. And that's it. That's all the training you have to be able to treat yourself or your buddy. You're not trained to do anything else. So what are you going to do? You're going to look for someone with this on his arm, probably also painted on his helmet, that red cross. That indicates a medic. And the combat medics are some of the great heroes on D-Day. These men come into battle, charging across those beaches of Normandy, typically unarmed. They might carry a sidearm, a pistol, probably not even that. They have no weapon. They are there carrying medical supplies. They are carrying, early on in the battle at least, blood or plasma to give transfusions. And they are there for a whole different purpose than everyone else on the beach. They're there to render first aid, to stabilize a wounded man, treat him for shock, stop his bleeding, suture a wound, certainly give morphine as a painkiller, or the disinfectant powder that I mentioned before on the wound. They are there to save lives, and they do a tremendous job under fire. Question often comes up then, what about this red cross on their arm and on their helmet? Did that make them a target? The answer is typically on D-Day, not so much. The Germans didn't typically target the Allied medics. It did happen. I've heard from veterans who say that, yes, they saw a medic targeted by a sniper, for instance, but typically the Germans respected that convention and did not target the medics. If nothing else, if they start shooting our medics, we're apt to start shooting their medics, and they didn't want to see that happen. Plus, the Allied medics, incidentally, they're treating wounded Germans as well on D-Day. So if they come across a German who needs, bleeding stopped or treated for shock, they will do that as well. So typically they weren't targeted in the European theater, but it could happen. And they are some of the great heroes on D-Day. Now, the last thing, of course, you're going to have to carry on D-Day is your weapon. And what you're going to carry on D-Day is going to depend on what your job is. An officer may not carry one of these. He may only have a sidearm or smaller carbine rifle instead of this one. A man who is assigned to a machine gun squad may not have this. The medics, as I already say, typically are not armed. But for most of the Americans, at least, coming across the beaches on D-Day, they have this, which is the M1 Garand rifle, the primary infantry weapon of World War II. And it was widely respected as a very good weapon. The Germans really thought a lot of this, and the American soldier really thought a lot of it. If you are part of the invasion force on D-Day, you have trained extensively with the M1 Garand. You know how to take it apart, put it back together, blindfolded at night in your sleep. You are very well trained in this, and you are probably a pretty good marksman. If you, for instance, had bad vision and couldn't shoot very well, you were long ago taken out of the frontline infantry units and given another job in the Army. If you are invading, you have spent hours on the rifle range practicing with this, and you are probably a pretty good shot. You're carrying with you as many as 500 or 600 rounds of ammunition for the fight. You may not need that many on D-Day. In fact, a lot of men never fire a shot at all on D-Day. And so, because they couldn't see the enemy. But they are there for the duration. And so they're carrying not just enough for the battle on D-Day itself, but for the next few days until they can be resupplied. The M1 Garand was an excellent weapon, and say many of the men swore by it. And it's really this weapon that helped us to win the war, not only on D-Day, but throughout all of World War II. So that is some of the equipment that I would be carrying. Again, there's a lot of variation in what they might have and what they might be doing with that equipment. But this is typical of what might have been carried by the average American soldier on D-Day. All right, we're going to hold it there, I think, and take any questions that you have. So if you have any questions about the equipment, about D-Day, about the Germans, we haven't talked a whole lot about the enemy on D-Day. But if you have any of those questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A feature, and we will try to answer it. Always tell students when they're here, I can answer any question you have. The answer might be, I don't know, but I'll have an answer for it. So Maggie, do you have anything?
We do. Could you repeat the date again and tell us why this invasion is called D-Day?
Very good question. The date was June 6th, 1944. It had originally been scheduled for June 5th, but that was one of the stormiest days of all summer on June 5th. And so the commander, General Eisenhower, postponed the invasion for 24 hours, and D-Day comes in as June 6th, 1944. Why D-Day? A lot of people take guesses of what the D might stand for in D-Day, and the answer really is nothing. It's merely the way a military planning designates the day an operation starts. 4 days before an operation starts is D-4. 3 days afterwards is D+3. So what is the day itself? The military terminology was D-Day. It doesn't stand for anything, it's just D-Day. So every military operation of World War II had a D-Day. Only this one, because it's so important, such an important step toward us winning the war, only this one goes down in history as D-Day. Very good question.
One that's interesting to me is, what was the ratio of medics to soldiers?
Typically for every 500 men or so, you'd have 25 or 30 medics in a battalion. It varied. And because I said earlier that the medics weren't typically targeted by the Germans specifically. However, that doesn't mean they were out of danger by any means. An artillery shell coming in, fired by the Germans, might be miles away. It hits the beach. It doesn't know if you've got that red cross on your arm and your helmet or not. And so many medics are killed on D-Day, not specifically targeted necessarily, but in harm's way anyway. And so how many medics were there per men? Really not enough, because some of them were killed, some of them lost their equipment. And the ones who survived and remained active, though, they did an amazing job. So they are some of the great heroes of D-Day.
So to switch to a question we have from Facebook, we have from Rose Ellenberger, were MG-42s the only machine guns used on D-Day?
They were the primary German machine gun. That's a very good question, Rose. The Germans had other machine guns, but the MG-42 was the one that was most dangerous. And other than the artillery, I'm pretty sure about this, the most wounds were caused by the MG-42. Wasn't the only weapon, because of course we had our weapons as well, our machine guns, right down to the small Thompson machine guns that a few of the men would be carrying, up to big 50 caliber machine guns, like our founder Bob Slaughter, who founded the National D-Day Memorial. He was part of a machine gun squad. But the MG-42 was the one that was most feared by the Allies. Very good question.
So one that I keep getting over and over again is, people have noticed a certain piece of equipment on the table that was a weapon used on D-Day, the grenade. Could you talk a little bit about that for us?
Absolutely. The hand grenade. And by the way, all the weapons I've shown you, I suppose if I drop this on my foot, it might hurt me, but it's empty. This is not explosive. The rifle I showed you won't fire. So this is perfectly safe to handle. But this is the typical grenade that would have been issued to the men. They would have worn it, some cases, on a sort of strap here where they can get to them quickly, sometimes in a pouch. But this is something you want to get to quickly. And it is, of course, a small explosive bomb that's thrown by the individual man. How it works, of course, and they would have extensive training in this as well, is you hold down this lever right there called the spoon, and you pull this ring out. And now this is in there very tightly, right? Even though this one won't explode on D-Day, they might. If your pin came out before you wanted to throw it, or say on the landing craft, that's a big problem. So you wanted this thing in there pretty tightly, and these are. But you pull this out, you pull it with your fingers, by the way. You watch some of the movies. Back in the day, they grab one with their teeth and do that. And, you know, that gets you a trip to the regimental dentist the next day, because these things are hard to pull. But you pull it out, and then once you throw it, you have about 5 seconds before it explodes. And so this grenade, that's often called the pineapple grenade, because you notice the ridges in there that make it look like a pineapple. This was very widely respected by the enemy. They did not want to see one of these come flying into their foxhole by any means. So not every man had grenades on D-Day, but many of them did, and it was an important step in winning the battle as well. Very good question. Sorry I forgot that earlier.
Totally fine. So another question we keep getting, and I think this is incredibly significant to why we're here as the National D-Day Memorial, is how many Allied soldiers died on D-Day?
Very good question. The National D-Day Memorial is actually the only institution in the entire world that has researched that question exhaustively. And when I say exhaustively, I don't mean we have a final answer, because we're continuing to research. On D-Day, there was chaos, as you can imagine. Men were killed on D-Day, and maybe their body wasn't found for a few days, or men were killed on D-Day, but the paperwork on their death wasn't done for, you know, however many days. And so there is no easy answer to that question, because we are certain men died on D-Day, that their military records say a different death date. However, even accounting for that, we have identified by name 4,415 Allied soldiers, sailors, airmen, Coast Guardsmen who died just on D-Day itself. And that includes 2,502 American soldiers. So 4,415 men who died just on D-Day that we know, and we know there were certainly many more that we can't prove that was the day they died. That doesn't count, incidentally, a man who was wounded on D-Day and died 2 days later. Doesn't count the men who continued to give their lives later in the campaign. But even so, that's why this is such an important date to remember. These men gave their lives to secure victory in Europe, and they need to be remembered. And when you come to the National D-Day Memorial, someday you will see plaques that record every single one of those 4,415 names.
Another question, we've gotten a few about this as well, is did the equipment for paratroopers differ from what we just saw for a GI?
It did. The paratroopers, again, depends on what their job is, but they will probably be jumping with some slightly different equipment, certainly with a different uniform, because they've got jump boots on and different type of parachute uniforms. And their bayonet might be something that is more geared toward parachuting rather than what I showed you earlier. And say they are much more concerned with weight as well, because these guys coming out of the landing craft carrying 80 to 100 pounds of equipment, that's tough. These are young men in good physical shape, but even carrying that much is very difficult. Now picture a paratrooper who's jumping out of an airplane and landing with all of that equipment. He's got to be even more concerned. So say they did have some different uniforms. They may have a net with camouflage to be able to camouflage their helmets. And say depends on what their job is, whether they're carrying the M1 Garand that I showed you, or a lighter M1 carbine rifle, or a machine gun, or a radio man might have a big giant radio on his back. So they're going to have slightly different equipment. As I say, probably no two men on D-Day had exactly the same things.
Another question is, when did D-Day end?
Well, D-Day itself was just June 6, 1944. However, that was only the beginning of the campaign to liberate France and push on into Germany. The goal, of course, is to win the war in Europe by defeating Nazi Germany. And we understand when we land, when we're planning the invasion long before we land, we understand that that's going to take a drive through France and then into Germany against some of the most heavily fortified borders anyone had ever tried to cross. And so D-Day itself was only one day, but the campaign to, first of all, fight through Normandy goes into August And then it's going to be even longer past that before we have liberated all of France and pushed on into Germany. D-Day did not win the war in 1944. It's going to be 11 months and many more men giving their lives before the war will end. But D-Day was an important step in getting our way to that victory in Europe.
So over the last 2 minutes, we have had a ton of questions about the role of women on D-Day and why they weren't allowed to fight. Can you talk a little bit more about that and if any women were involved with the invasion?
Absolutely. Well, the one woman did land on D-Day, a war correspondent by the name of Martha Gellhorn. And if you tune back in with us on Thursday, Maggie's going to be doing a program on Martha Gellhorn. Now, for D-Day itself, though, first of all, in World War II, women were not assigned to combat roles. And so the men crossing the beaches were men, right? So there were no women actually in combat roles. However, women, first of all, are supporting the invasion. There are women in the Army, in the Navy, and they may be back in England doing other jobs, but they're supporting the invasion to be sure. And then also women are coming into Normandy within 2 or 3 days after D-Day as nurses, and especially the flight nurses who come in on airplanes to evacuate wounded soldiers back across the channel by air. They are also stepping into harm's way and risking their lives in order to treat the wounded and evacuate them. So there were women certainly involved, but not as the frontline combat soldier. That didn't happen in World War II.
Perfect. Well, thank you guys so much for asking all of these different questions. I know we had so many and we did not have time to get to them all. So if you have any questions left over, feel free to email us at education@dday.org. Also know that we have a ton of virtual programs coming up on various different topics, from spies in World War II, specifically looking at women who were spies, looking at Martha Gellhorn, the only known woman to land on D-Day, looking at the role of Walt Disney in World War II, maybe survival kits. If you really were interested in medics in World War II, we'll be talking more about that as well. So visit our website for more information about how to tune in. And just so you know, it's all going to be free. So our website is www.dday.org. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you guys again soon.